The Russo-Japanese War was fought from February of 1904 to September of 1905, starting with the surprise attack on Port Arthur and ending on land with the Battle of Mukden and at sea with the Battle of Tashima. If you want to learn more specifics about this conflict, I have 2 other videos on my channel, so I will put links in the description. Instead, this video is focused on how a massive country like Russia could lose a war to a small island nation like Japan. For starters, let's give some context into why this was such an upset. At the time, Russia had a total population of 130 million, with an army capable of putting over 3 million men into the field, while Japan's population was only 46 million, with only a capability to put 500,000 troops into the field. At sea, Russia could rely on 21 total battleships compared to Japan's 7. Also, Japan did not have the capability to make any major repairs to their capital ships in their own dockyards. Russia had a larger economy, could produce more coal, which was the fuel for ships at the time, was self-sufficient in agricultural production, which Japan was not, and had a larger munitions production ability. So how in the hell did Russia not only lose this war, but lost every single battle? This wasn't just a win for Japan, but total domination. There are 4 main points of failure which severely impacted Russia's ability to win this war. I'm going to go over each of these 4, and then at the end explain how, if those 4 had been altered, how they may have been able to win the war. Let's kick this off by going into both sides' strategic plans for the war. For Japan, they had a clear vision of how they were going to approach this conflict. After all, they had essentially been planning it for 9 years, ever since the end of the Sino-Japanese War, when Russia, Germany, and France intervened and forced Japan to give up their claims on the Korean and Manchurian regions. Japan was going to strike hard and fast, taking as much key ground as possible from Port Arthur to Mukden. While at sea, they were looking to keep the 2 Russian Far East fleets, one at Port Arthur and the other at Vladivostok, from uniting. If those 2 fleets united, it would give the Russian Navy a decisive firepower advantage over Japan in the Far East. Then, they were looking for a decisive naval battle to destroy the Russian Navy's ability to threaten and destroy the link between the Korean and Manchurian forces with the Japanese islands. The goal was to make this a short war. Their generals knew that the longer the war went, the more the Russian advantages would take a toll. So now for the Russian strategy, which was non-existent. Russian leaders did not believe a war with Japan was a possibility. They figured that there was no way Japan would risk taking on the might of Russia, so there's no need to draw up contingency plans for a war that wasn't going to happen. So, when Port Arthur was surprise attacked, not only did it leave the fleet stunned by the boldness of the attack, but it left the Russian military leaders to on the fly figure out a war plan for a region they had not properly mapped out. Most hadn't even been to Manchuria, while any investment into adequate intelligence into Japanese military capabilities had never happened. It put the Russian military into a purely reactionary strategy, clueless to what was coming next, surrendering all initiative to the Japanese. At sea, even after the Port Arthur surprise attack, the Russian Navy was not doomed. The attack had more symbolic damage than actual damage, as the 2 battleships that were sunk were both in shallow water and were eventually repaired. However, because of the lack of direction or initiative, the Russian Port Arthur fleet only made 1 serious attempt to link up with the Vladivostok fleet, leading to the Battle of the Yellow Sea. After that battle, most of the ships were forced to return to Port Arthur, where they resigned themselves to their fate, eventually being destroyed by the advancing Japanese land forces. The Baltic fleet that was supposed to be Port Arthur's relief force wasn't even launched until October of 1904, a full 8 months after the surprise attack that opened the war. It was so late that by the time it reached Singapore, Port Arthur had already fallen. That Baltic fleet wasn't exactly cream of the crop either. Most sailors were new to their ships and had not properly trained on them. It was a thrown-together ad hoc relief force. During their 18,000-mile journey, they had to overload their ships with coal, since the rules of war didn't allow neutral nations to allow entry of warships from feuding states. Having that much coal stuffed on the ship made the ship slower and dirtier, causing plenty of sickness and discomfort among the crew. As well, food is hard to preserve at sea for that long, so a lot of it spoiled, forcing the crew to live in dirty, deteriorating ships eating rotten food. Even with Port Arthur already fallen, they were still tasked with linking up with the Vladivostok fleet, leading them directly to the disaster at Tashima. That journey perfectly encapsulates Russian leadership's lack of a clear strategic vision, sending out the last of their capital ships on an insanely long journey without logistical support, hoping they could win a key battle, but ultimately leading them to their doom. On land, the strategic plan was no better. In the Manchurian region, Russia only had 80,000 soldiers. Like I said, they didn't believe that Japan would risk a war with them, so these troops were mainly in Manchuria to protect against local rebellion. Once war broke out, they didn't have the numbers or the quality of troops to counter the Japanese offensive. So the commanding general, Kuropatkin, chose a defensive strategy, trying to form a defensive line just south of Mukden at Laoyaoyang, on the crucial railway line that connected the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Port Arthur. In theory, the goal was to trade space for time, a very common military strategy, and wait for reinforcements across the Trans-Siberian Railroad, then launch a counteroffensive to retake the lost ground. The problem was shit execution. For one, Kuropatkin didn't exactly have an iron grip on his generals. For example, at the Yalu River, the commanding general was supposed to continue the withdrawal, but instead chose to stand and fight. When his army was annihilated, it left Kuropatkin with even less troops at his disposal. As well, the Trans-Siberian Railroad was very unreliable. During the winter season, parts of it froze over, making the passage all but impossible, and creating a troop transportation logistical nightmare. And finally, the troops in Manchuria were of extremely low quality, since Russian strategic planners were expecting Europe to be the most likely area of conflict, leaving Manchuria with second-rate soldiers. That leads me into my next key component: Japanese quality versus Russian quality. Japan may not have had the raw numbers in men or materials, but it had much superior quality. At sea, Japanese ships were made by the English, so they were of superior speed, firepower, range-finding technology, and wireless communication ability. Combine that with Japan being an island nation with a large pool of experienced seamen to draw from to fill out their naval force, and you have a very formidable Japanese navy, while Russian citizens were mostly farmers or industrial workers, since the nation did not have a robust merchant marine or overseas trading network. Most of Russia's trade was within Europe. That's why when the Baltic fleet set sail, they had a large number of sailors who had never even been to sea. It's no wonder the losses in the Battle of Tsushima were so staggering. On land, I mentioned earlier the Russian army of Manchuria was not given the best of the best. Those were needed much closer to St. Petersburg to protect the capital and Russia proper in case of war in Europe or rebellion. Even Russia's best of the best were not highly trained or organized. Well, compare that to Japan's experienced and rigorously trained army. These strictly trained men had already fought and defeated China only 9 years previous, and were fighting very close to home. Which brings me to my next component: motivation. Russia was the key driver behind Japan losing the territory they won in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. And as a nation, Japan was obsessed with revenge. Korea is in their backyard, only about 600 miles away, and right after they ceded the Liaotung Peninsula, Russia took it over. It is strategically critical for Japan to win this war, or their very existence is at threat. Everyday Russians, on the other hand, care very little for gaining a warm water port or increased influence in China and Manchuria. When the soldiers completed their long journey across the Trans-Siberian Railroad to see the bleak landscape that greeted them, the motivation to die for it was empty. So, on the one side, you have a people hungry to show they are a world power against another who has a plethora of other domestic issues, fighting in an area with no impact to their survival as a state. Looking at that, you can see why the Japanese were more ready to endure the hardships of this war over the Russians. So on to the final component: overconfidence. Overconfidence is nothing new in war. Russia simply never thought a small island nation like Japan could have a chance against them in a war. That's why they didn't come up with a coherent pre-war plan, or invested in intelligence into Japanese war capabilities. Some of this was based purely on race. Tsar Nicholas was vocal in his belief that an Asian military would have no chance in the field against a European one, and that opinion was no doubt shared by plenty of Russia's senior military leadership. What's indicative of how high the levels of overconfidence were is when you think about how the Russian leaders thought a war in Manchuria could only happen if they wanted it. That's a supreme level of confidence, that you are so powerful that a neighbor with grievances against you will never resort to military action because it's so obviously futile. So let's sum this all up. Russia lost because they never developed a clear strategic plan, while relying on quantity of arms rather than quality, without any real high motivating factor to drive its military, in diluting itself that because they were a European power, no small Asian nation could realistically stand up to them. That is the perfect cocktail for a military disaster. How Russia could have achieved success isn't too hard to figure out. It starts with pre-war planning. And it doesn't have to be any crazy in-depth wargaming, just a basic drawn-out goals on how to approach a war with Japan, maximizing Russian strengths in hitting at Japanese weaknesses, like working to combine the Port Arthur and Vladivostok fleets to avoid defeat in detail, or abandoning Port Arthur early to solidify all your strength along the Laoyaoyang and Mukden rail lines, in order to await the masses of reinforcements from the Trans-Siberian Railroad. At the end of the day, just using the strength of Russia's size to win a war of attrition, that Japan would have no hope in. But the structure of Russian society and military left that kind of realistic war planning impossible. A humiliating loss to a nation like Japan, in retrospect, was not as crazy as an upset as it appeared to observers then. And hopefully, after watching this, the viewer has a better understanding that winning a war is less about raw strength and more about motivation, strong strategic planning, and clear logistical support. That's the context that decides the fates of nations.
Well, about time for me to be hitting the old dusty trail.